Day 49. Portoba to Deer Lake. I woke up early, not fully rested as I went to bed late. I tossed and turned a lot last night before eventually falling asleep to the sounds of the waves and wind. I looked out to see that I was the only one left at the rest stop. The few vehicles that were here last night had already left, despite it being quite early. The sun was starting to peek over the hills in front of me. This particular rest stop was absolutely stunning. There was a small body of water in front of me, and the mountainous areas just beyond that. I had seen a little bit of it last night when I arrived, but seeing it now in the morning, it was just incredible. I walked over to a ditch, and out in the open, without any shelter, I took a piss on the side of the highway. A few cars passed by, but there was nothing I could do aside from shield myself from the wind. Between choosing to piss away from the wind and shielding myself from possible embarrassment, I chose to piss away from the wind. Nature called and I had to answer. After relieving myself, I fired up my beast and started heading north. I researched a spot not too far away called the Starlight Trail, which was just off the highway. After a quick but scenic drive, I found the trailhead and pulled over. Just days ago, I hiked the Theodore Fricker Mountain Trail on Cape Breton Island without any water or food. A stupid move that I knew I wouldn't do again. So I ate some food, drank some water, and brought a little extra with me when I started the trail. The path was well worn and laid out, so there was no possibility of getting lost. It wasn't well maintained, however, as in the beginning the boardwalk had sunken into the mud, and most of it was in poor condition. Again, I had to remind myself that this was Newfoundland, one of the poorest provinces in Canada, and quite opposite of British Columbia. The trail started off flat, and I could see that in the distance it would climb up the mountain. There was a large clearing to provide access to the power lines, something that was essential to the infrastructure of the area, but otherwise quite ugly in such a beautiful environment. Eventually, I made it into the forested area where I continued along the path. I reached a fork in the path, and I wasn't quite sure where to go. My app indicated to continue deeper into the forest, but an arrow on the tree pointed another direction. After some backtracking and indecisiveness, I followed my app. Eventually, I cleared out of the forest and began a steep ascent up the mountain. It was quite different from the mountains I used to hike back in British Columbia. This mountain was far more shallow in terms of overall height, and it had lush vegetation. There was no exposed rock, unlike what I was used to. As the ascent began to get steeper, I was slipping along the slightly muddy trail leading up to the summit. My legs were starting to ache despite doing stretches before starting the hike. The real reason was I was out of shape. Again, back in Victoria, I exercised 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. I haven't worked out since Ottawa weeks ago. Several times throughout this hike, I thought of turning back. First when I was lost in the woods, then going up this mountain, but I decided that overall I didn't come this far to turn back down. I remembered the regret I felt not going to the Canadian flag resting at the top of Theodore Fricker Mountain. But this time I was better prepared with food and water. So I continued hiking to the top until eventually I reached the peak. Looking back, I could see my beast far in the distance. The lush vegetation here was something quite different from what I was used to. It was also extremely windy, something I almost never felt when hiking. The top of the mountain was flat, plateau-like, and I continued walking the well-worn path until I reached the marker. Looking around, it was absolutely beautiful. The terrain of Newfoundland, at least from what I've seen so far, was absolutely gorgeous. nature in its most natural form, aside from the power lines and the highway below. In the distance, I seen a large lake with larger, taller mountains feeding water right into it. Looking south, I could see how tectonic movement over the millions of years formed this long chain of mountains, stretching up and down the western coast of Newfoundland. This reminded me of the plaque I read when traveling through the Cabot Trail just days ago. Looking back at my trip, I remember driving through northwestern Ontario with all of its lakes off the highway and how beautiful it was. Then traveling through the Gaspé region of Quebec and how stunning it was along the St. Lawrence with the Atlantic Ocean by my side. Then traveling through Prince Edward Island and its iconic red beaches and lighthouses along the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, my most recent experience on Cape Breton Island with its natural beauty in every direction. But Newfoundland was different. This was raw, rugged, unforgivingly beautiful. I could have stayed right on this spot, but the wind was so strong that I knew I had to descend and return to my beast. I walked around a little further just to be amazed by how lush the landscape was. I could imagine just hiking and camping in this area for days, with the ocean in the distance and the unpolluted night sky to say goodnight. This, by far, was not the most difficult hike that I have experienced on my trip, but definitely the most beautiful so far. I eventually started making my way back to my beast, retracing my steps until I reached her. Switching out of my hiking gear, I found myself hungry, so I needed a place to eat. I peeled out of the trailhead, hitting the Trans-Canada Highway number 1 heading north. The roads in Newfoundland, so far, were in fairly good condition. Nothing as good as the roads through Alberta, but definitely much better than northwestern Ontario. Driving along the Trans-Canada Highway number 1, I ventured further inland and away from the ocean. Along the way, I found numerous areas where one could stop and legally car camp for the evening. I wasn't sure why this was done. My only guess at the time was to prevent people from driving in the dark when wildlife collisions were a significant hazard. The highways here in Newfoundland weren't lit up like the rest of the country. I passed by a number of abandoned businesses along the way. There were signs of economic downturn that Newfoundland and the rest of Atlantic Canada had experienced over the decades. These businesses were lost long before COVID. Eventually, I stopped at an Irving petrol station where I filled up my beast and sat down for breakfast. It was a trip back in time, sitting down at a roadside diner having a traditional Canadian breakfast. This was something that was actually quite common in Atlantic Canada. A petrol station off the highway with a diner attached to it. This was Crabs River Restaurant, which was serving a delicious and hearty breakfast. It was perfect timing, after finishing off such a lovely hike at the Starlight Trail and a scenic rip along the highway, refueling my beast, and my belly was something that needed to be done. After enjoying my heavy breakfast, I researched another cool area to check out. Again, everything on this trip was spontaneous. I found Butte du Cap Park. Apparently, it was supposed to be a Newfoundland version of Le Butte de Le Mont in Parc National Forêt in Quebec. After a steady and scenic drive continuing north, I headed west through Stephenville, where I seen beautiful homes along the shoreline as the road ventured closer to the water. Eventually, I reached Butte du Cap Park, arrived in this beautiful cliffside park overlooking the Gulf of St. Lawrence. While the sky was slightly overcast, the surroundings were absolutely stunning. While Le Butte de Le Mont in Quebec was beautiful, here in Newfoundland, Le Butte du Cap Park was even more beautiful. So far, Newfoundland was proving to be much more raw and natural than many other places I have visited previously. Throughout my trip, I have seen the splendor of nature, but here in Newfoundland, it was just surreal. The wind was strong and harsh to the point that I had to fight it just to walk. I carefully walked over towards the cliff but kept my distance. These cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean were easily 30 to 50 meters tall, with death waiting for me below. The wind-swept vegetation grew at an angle, almost as if it was forced by nature to retreat inwards. In the park there were outhouses, and the heavy breakfast I had earlier had to be expelled. I felt the grumbling in my stomach as I knew that there was a log jam just waiting to break through. I ran towards the outhouse, where I whipped open the door, only to find that it had no toilet paper. I went to the next one, where again I was greeted with nothing but an empty cardboard roll. Thankfully, I was very well prepared. I ran towards my beast with all of my might and fury, as I knew the logjam in my guts was just about to ruin my entire day. I grabbed some toilet paper and sprinted back to the outhouse. In the process, I passed by an elderly couple who seen me in plain view. A guy running towards the outhouse with a roll of toilet paper only meant one thing. He had an epic battle to fight, and one that he must win at all costs. After what was a furious battle, I exited the outhouse victorious that I didn't soil myself. I continued to walk around the park where I found a bread oven that would, under non-COVID restrictions, bake fresh bread for park visitors during certain days. I also found another memorial about the deportation of Acadians from modern-day Newfoundland. It was a sad reminder about one of Canada's many dark sides of its history. I continued to walk around the park in the midst of this brutally strong wind coming off the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There were some other people here, and I walked past the elderly couple who witnessed me prepare myself for an epic battle in the outhouse. I waved to them, and I'm sure they knew I came out victorious. They probably tried not to laugh inside, as it would have been funny to see someone sprint towards an outhouse with a roll of toilet paper in their hands. I reached one of the most photographed areas on Buttercup Park. The wind was howling, pushing me away from the cliff's edge, almost like a sign of God to stay away from a most certain death. I heeded the warning and took several pictures from a vantage point that was much more safe. Again, like many of the picturesque places I have visited in Atlantic Canada, it was a sight to behold in all directions. A sense of gratitude came over me again. I had to remind myself that here I was, in the midst of a global pandemic, exploring without any obligations and enjoying my adventures with no one to answer to. Living on the west coast of Canada, the provinces of British Columbia and Alberta have always been seen as the most beautiful region in Canada. While there are some spectacular areas in those two provinces, I found Atlantic Canada my true home, where there was a beauty in the earth, in the sky, and in the water, along with friendly people. This underdeveloped, less visited area of Canada was a true gem that had to be experienced to be appreciated. Not to give any less credit to the beauty of Prince Edward Island and my home province of Nova Scotia, but Newfoundland stood out as the nature was so surreal, and the lack of development in this province, at least from what I've seen so far, made it one of the most breathtaking landscapes I've ever seen during my travels. Like the Starlight Trail earlier this morning, I was standing on what felt like the top of the world. Looking in all directions, I felt peace and tranquility, far away from the noise of urban environments. I felt the calmness that I haven't felt in a long time. Both before and during this trip, I've experienced challenges. I despised my working situation back in Victoria for a year prior to my trip. I've hated the restrictions since COVID changed the world, and I've struggled to find a place to stealth car camp, and the unplanned, spontaneous nature of my adventure came at a cost. But all of that led to this, me finally reaching the last province throughout my adventure. After weeks of travel and countless memories, I've made it here to Newfoundland, standing along the western tip of Bootacap Park. I enjoyed the sense of calmness a little longer. Then I returned to my beast. I fired her up, headed out, and drove towards Deer Lake, the next destination and the place that I would stay for the evening. Along the way, I found myself needing to use the washroom again. And along the highway, I came across a ski hill, the Marble Mountain Resort. Since there was a pandemic and it was summertime, it wasn't in use, but it did have something quite interesting. A massive totem pole, the Newfoundland and Labrador heritage tree. This symbolic giant stood at the base of the Marble Mountain Resort, like a beckoning call. I admit I didn't have time to pull over and explore as I desperately needed to use the washroom. And I even considered taking a piss somewhere on the grounds out in the open, but I just didn't want to be that guy that disrespected such a pristine environment. Thankfully, just down the road was a Tim Hortons, where I relieved myself with such splendor, mystified with the challenges both my bowels and my bladder had to face this day. I grabbed a quick bite as well, more processed filth to enter my body, while I researched my next stop to car camp. I learned that at Deer Lake was a well-known, not-so-stealth car camping spot frequented by travelers. A quick drive down and I located the spot. I pulled over, as it was just off the highway where I came across other people who were traveling as well. I ended up speaking to a local Newfoundlander as well as a Frenchman from St. Pierre and Miquelon. We chatted for a while and I felt like I was back in Quebec, as the Frenchman was quite sarcastic in his speech. He recommended that I visited St. Pierre and Miquelon one day when things died down and the world returned to normal. He also recommended that I hike the Green Gardens Trail, where I could find sheep. I definitely took note of that. After chatting up these two characters, I decided to retrace my steps and head over to Corner Brook. Corner Brook was just half an hour south of the car camping spot in Deer Lake, and I picked up some things at Walmart I needed as I was running out of supplies. Corner Brook was a surprisingly nice little city. It was quite a bit larger than I expected it to be, and it was set in a beautiful harbor and was quite steep in many sections. Strangely, I craved sushi, so I found the only sushi restaurant in the entire town and picked up some dinner. To my surprise, something that I came to realize was how expensive everything here was in Newfoundland. The sushi cost even more than the sushi I bought in Ottawa. And while it was definitely better than any of the sushi I had in Ottawa, it certainly came at a steep price. Nevertheless, I returned to my car camping spot in Deer Lake as the sun started to set. I finished my above average, but not nearly as good as Vancouver, sushi, and then set myself up to go to bed. My first full day in Newfoundland was coming to a close. I had my rear seats down in my beast, my air mattress inflated, my pillow and blanket set up, and my bladder was empty. I was ready to go to bed. I woke up this morning with the beautiful sunrise coming over the mountains, and now the night sky was setting in. I hiked the Starlight Trail, explored the Bootacap Park, and finally found some good sushi. And I had a delightful chat with some strange but interesting characters. As I settled in for the evening, I just realized that I left my sunglasses on the ferry. These sunglasses have followed me across the country. I purchased them back in Revelstoke. No matter, I thought that perhaps someone else could use them now. Otherwise, it had been an adventurous day. I closed my eyes to the sounds of ducks nearby and the highway traffic just meters away. But my mind was at ease with wonderful memories of today's excursions. More adventures would come quite soon.
Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.